Greetings, folks. I can't see you, but you can see me, and welcome to the webinar, and thanks for joining in. I'm going to open up with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ed Treat, Reverend Dr. Ed Treat, who will do introductions, and we'll get this thing going, and he'll also explain a little bit how this works. So let's pray. Creator God, thank you that we can join with each other with technology, learn new things about your world. May we have open minds and hearts to what we hear tonight, and may we be a blessing to your world as you are a blessing to us. Again, thank you for this opportunity and the gifts of modern technology. We pray in Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Gail. So hello, everyone. I'm Pastor Ed Treat, and just before we start, I'm going to have Michael, if you could try and send me that again. It's asking me I don't know if there's a way to send it differently. It's asking me to have a Microsoft account. So you may have to run the slide yourself.
Yeah, I'll just run it. Don't worry about it.
All right, thanks. All right, well, thanks, Gail, for inviting us here, and welcome to all of you that are watching. Want to let you know that at the bottom of your page, there's a button that says Q&A. So if you have any questions at any point, I'll be monitoring that as Michael shares tonight, and I can intervene on your behalf and ask him questions. You certainly can ask me questions at any point. Some of the questions I can answer directly behind the scenes. I can type an answer, but if it's an answer that you want me to put forward to the group and to Michael, then I can do that as well. So use that Q&A button. But we're glad you're here, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I was 5 years into recovery. I grew up in a really crazy family, and I ended up going to treatment for addiction at age 27, and ended up going off to seminary after I started getting my life back together. So, I have the story of the prodigal son. God, welcomed me back and gave me a life after I had done everything I could to destroy it. And so I'm really grateful for having gone through what I went through, but especially grateful that there was a way for me to get well. And so that's where I get my passion for this work. And so I went into the ministry actually thinking, this would be a big part of what I do. But after I got ordained and took my first call in rural Nebraska, what I found was the church really doesn't have a place for this conversation. The church really isn't comfortable with this conversation. And so I just didn't feel like there was much interest. So what I did was I joined a group called the Fellowship of Recovering Lutheran Clergy. And they were just forming when I was at seminary, and I got in on the ground floor with that group. And what we started doing was helping clergy who were struggling with addiction and alcohol problems and whatnot. Because back in 1990, 30 years ago, clergy weren't supposed to have issues. They were supposed to be perfect, right? So when they had a problem, they would get thrown to the curb. And we wanted to advocate for better treatment. So we have been a force for other clergy and trying to help the church save the lives of some of these folks that are struggling and treat them as though they had a health issue, which is what we believe this is. It's not a moral issue, but a health issue. And so we wanted to be a voice for the afflicted and help clergy. So that's what we've done for the last 30 years. We've tried to introduce the topic to the greater church, but just didn't get much traction. About 4 years ago, I heard Amy Klobuchar speak at a state gathering in Minneapolis where they were talking about the opioid crisis and what to do about it. And she gave a very impassioned plea and said, everything we're doing is making the problem worse, because what we can control are the laws, and we can make it harder for people to get legal drugs. And so what happened is a lot of those folks, many of them with an opioid addiction, had to go to the streets to get something to replace that addiction, because it's a really tough drug to get off of. And what has happened is, as you well know, probably have read about, is that the street drugs are all laced with fentanyl now. And so you have people who are not able to tolerate it and are dying. And so we had, before the COVID problem hit, the addiction pandemic, we already had a huge problem with overdoses in this country. But since COVID, the last 2 years, the numbers are skyrocketing. They were already bad. And so our organization decided that the church really needed to play a role. When I heard Amy Klobuchar speak, I thought, why isn't the church more active on this topic? And so we put together a conference, and we're surprised when so many came. They came from 17 different denominations and from 37 different states. And people are, finally recognizing that we have this major problem in this country, and that we need to do something. And I really believe, there's a church or a synagogue or a mosque on every corner in this country. And if they were to do just a little bit, we could really have an impact. And so it begins with education. It begins with understanding what it is we're dealing with. And most people in our society are about 50 years behind in their understanding and knowledge. And so the Center of Addiction and Faith was created to try to get faith communities and clergy and people who are spiritual leaders up to speed with what we're dealing with, because it's a complex issue and the solutions are complex, and the things we're doing about it today are just not working. In fact, almost everything we're doing about it today is making the problem worse. Our drug policies are horrible. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but it's a problem. And in fact, as an introduction to our main speaker here tonight, I want to just share my screen here and show you, I think it's good that we just sort of get our heads around these numbers, because, it's pretty serious. I just read an article. I hope you can see this. I just read an article that last year, those under 55, more people under 55 died of alcohol-related issues than COVID. And so, and these, 55 and younger. So it's killing younger people. It's all preventable, and it's a horrible death. Overdose is just a horrible death. So as a way to start thinking about this problem and how urgent it is and how serious it is, I'm just going to throw some statistics at you. So this is from LifeWorks and Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Nearly 1/3 of people in the US who drink alcohol have increased their consumption since the pandemic began, and nearly 30% who use drugs reported an increase in that activity. That's not surprising. This is a pretty amazing statistic. Deaths from overdose rose 27% in the 12 months ending in August 2020 over the prior 20-month period, which was already pretty bad. These are the numbers related to alcohol deaths. 2021, about 95,000. Tobacco-related deaths, 480,000. Overdose deaths, over 100,000. Oh, you don't want to hear about Minnesota. You guys are in Wisconsin. Anyway, I'm sure you probably don't have a problem over there, but in Minnesota, we're losing people. And then there's a cost to us all, because it weighs on the medical system in our country and all the law enforcement, and it gets very expensive. So it's a very expensive issue for us all. You could see the numbers there. What I want to do at the Center of Addiction and Faith, though, is also help us realize that addiction isn't just about substances. We hear addiction and we think drug addicts, but there are other addictions that are ruining people's lives. Shopping, gambling, sexual activity, pornography, eating disorders, internet use, exercise, work. There's so many things we get addicted to. These process addictions harm an individual's physical and emotional health. They damage interpersonal relationships, and they cause legal and financial problems. When we come to church, we stand before God and say, God, we are in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. In other words, we have addictions to things that harm us, and we need your help to stop. I mean, to me, that's a confession. These are the kinds of people that are losing their lives. I'll just let you look at that for a second. So I think that the faith community over the years has not really dealt with this, but it's time we did. And I'd like to just, before I introduce Michael, make a case for that, because this is biblical. And the biblical reference, one of the many references I'd like to share is a little story from the Old Testament, from Genesis 9. And this is one they don't really teach in Sunday school, But the story of Noah and the flood and the rainbow, right? But after the rainbow, the ark comes to rest and they come out of the boat, and Noah, and here's where the text picks up. They come out of the ark, and Noah began to be a master of the soil, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself within his tent. Now in the Bible, whenever somebody's naked, it means they've acted shamefully. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness, and he told his two brothers outside, and Shem and Japheth took the garment, and they placed it on both of their shoulders, and they walked backwards, and they covered their father's nakedness, and their faces were turned backwards, so they did not see their father's nakedness, his shame. Noah woke from his wine, and he knew what his small son had done to him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, he shall be a slave among slaves to his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord of God of Shem, and may Canaan be a slave to them. May God expand Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be a slave to him." So Noah woke up from being drunk and got really mad at his youngest son for pointing it out. And he praises the two older sons for hiding it, covering it up. This is just the classic depiction of denial. I mean, this is the classic depiction of a dysfunctional alcoholic system. This happens in families, but it also happens in our society. And I think it's one of the reasons the church doesn't want to pay attention to this. I think we're kind of like these older brothers that say, yeah, we know there's a problem, but we don't want to point it out. We don't want to look at it. We'd just rather cover it up. And by not dealing with it, the problem doesn't go away. It gets worse. And so my passion as a pastor now, as a minister, is to, I've left my call as a senior pastor, and I'm doing this work full-time now to try to get faith communities to pay attention to this issue so that we can help try to resolve it somehow. But it's important that we understand what we're dealing with. We have a conference every year. We have a website that's full of great information. We have a downloadable free phone app that's got webinars like this. It's got podcasts, just a ton of resources. It's at your app store. It's free. Look for Center of Addiction and Faith. Please help yourself to that. So that's an introduction to the topic, and the person that I most appreciate his knowledge is Micheael Borowiak. He works at Traverse Counseling. He's been at all three of our conferences to talk about what addiction does to communities and families, and he's here tonight to share some of his wisdom and insight. He works a lot with faith communities. He understands some of the dynamics we work with in systems like this. So, Micheael, can you explain how all this works?
Happy to, Ed. Ed,
I gotta let you share the screen, right?
You bet. If you can do that, and then I can get my slides up. Folks, I'm just really grateful to be with you. And so I come to you today. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker. Have a history of working with families that frankly experience extraordinary difficulties, from addiction to high conflict. My agency has built and established a way to treat compulsive gaming that we're seeing with young people, ways to help them out of this. And we know that it's a family systems issue. And so myself and my team have a great passion for this work, grateful to be in supportive of Ed and his work, and just have a deep commitment. One of the other things I'd want you to know about Traverse Counseling and Consulting is that we're a general benefit corporation. It's something that Matt Myers and I, the co-owner, really decided as values that we needed to do something to make sure we're contributing to the community. And so we do a number of these presentations every year as a way to pay it forward, if you will, to try to make sure we're helping get upstream, if you will. We see the challenges coming down to us, but can we get ahead of things as much as possible in a proactive way? So that's a big part of the calling. One of the things that I would have you think about is when we talk about addiction, one of the things I would have you consider is really if everybody had their family tree sitting up there, and you shook every family tree, there's going to be one or two people or more that have struggled with some sort of substance use disorder or addiction. It is a profound disease that affects so many folks. And so I think this is something that I come to you today with compassion for families that have been in this struggle. It is also something that affects families across generations. Well, look at that. It's not quite working the way I want it to, you guys. My apologies here. Here we go. The other thing I'd have you know, based on my history and experience, is I have a history of doing substance use interventions, have done hundreds of them. I don't have time to do them anymore just because I've been so dedicated to working with families on a more long-term basis. But can tell you I've seen the effects of this on families. And it's not just the person with the disease. It's actually considered a disease that affects the whole family. And I would argue affects the whole community around the person. And so this is certainly something that affects my family system. I went back and looked back 3 generations as far as I could go, and I saw addiction all through those generations. I frequently tell my mother thank you to her, because she told me starting in early elementary school, she said, Michael, you need to watch out for alcohol because it's a factor that has affected our family for generations. And I thank her frequently for that, because it has, as a way she tried to help all of my siblings and I figure this out as best we could. So today I'm here to talk a bit about looking at kind of decoding family systems and the dynamics of addiction. And I put codependence up there as a question mark because it's a term that's often used that I'm frankly quite challenged by. And so we'll take some time to talk a bit about that. As we're going, I know Ed is going to add or jump in because he has a lot to add, and I appreciate being able to team together with Ed. If you have questions, folks, please feel free to put them in the chat component, and we want to try to be responsive to you as we go. So I always challenge people to be curious, and where there's curiosity, there's learning. So feel free to ask, and we'll do our best to respond to the questions you may have. I want to talk about families. When you think about addiction, you think about somebody that's struggling with it, but I want to move you into looking at families. So what I'm looking at today is to just clarify codependence and how a family system perspective assists us in understanding the behaviors associated with it and the limitations of its use. Some have, I think, rightly pointed out that codependence can be seen as a pathology, that there's something wrong with you. I want to have us look at it from a different angle. Would like to review the dynamics of family systems when a member has a substance use disorder, and to review some strategies to support families struggling with substance abuse disorders. What do we do? How do we walk into this, and how do we help? And the good news is we don't have to be experts at this. We have to have a caring heart to start with, and we'll be able to talk more about that. One of the struggles that we can walk in and talk about is certainly the taboo around this. There is a shame piece that comes with addiction that we'll talk about a little bit further down the road. But there are some characteristics that families that substance abuse have that I want to share with you. Families that have this really difficult disease often show a lack of flexibility, and so they struggle with typically families are found to be in a rigid pattern that's very difficult to move or change. They have really high levels of distress and dysfunction. They have low levels of family expressiveness. And that means like being able to share emotions with each other. With the exception, I would say, of often families can have either anger responses that can be part of the pattern, or complete avoidance. So there's low cohesion, low connection, and typically low agreement. This is an interesting one at the bottom here that I think is important. They call it a reciprocal causality. And what does this mean? It means that substance misuse leads to family dysfunction, but the family dysfunction and conflict also affects the substance misuse and relapse. And thus the two are interconnected. So one reinforces the other. And so this is part of the really stuck patterns that families can fall into with this. This is just an extraordinary disease.
You know, Micheal, if I can interject, I think about that piece of it. I know that if you send somebody off for treatment and don't deal with the family system they came out of, the chances of them getting well in that family are not very good unless you treat the whole family. And that's part of my passion in doing this work, is to say to the church and to our whole society, you know, we do have all these addicts, but the whole society needs treatment. I mean, we all need, and when I say treatment, I mean awareness. We need to understand how we're playing into this, because so many people come to me and say, as a pastor, the addicts don't come to me. It's the people who love them come to me and say, so-and-so, my cousin, my brother, my friend, my spouse has this problem. What do I do? And I say, well, you need to go get help. And they almost always say, oh, but I don't have it. And I'm like, well, yeah, you do, because you're connected to them and it's interconnected. You can't, if you're in a relationship with somebody who has this problem, it's affecting you. I think that's what I just heard you say.
Absolutely. And that is one of the struggles. I agree with you, Ed. It's often we'll get calls or, hey, my husband or my child or my father is struggling with this. What do I do? And you're right. It's getting them to take action. And there's so much fear and anxiousness and shame that comes with this, not only for the person with the disease, but the family around it. It's such a painful experience. So I have an interesting example that can help perhaps talk about this, and I'll read it to you, but you can read it as well. A stay-at-home mother drinks to the point of not being able to pick up her youngest child from school, manage the bills, or take care of the house. To keep the family functioning as normally as possible, her teenage daughter may take up these responsibilities rather than try to convince her mother to stop drinking. Thus, the mother continues to drink, knowing her daughter is there to pick up the pieces. It may seem illogical for the daughter to act in a way that actually supports her mother's alcohol use disorder, but she is just trying to keep her family functioning as consistently as possible. This is typical of families with substance use disorders. Members do their best to survive and try to prevent further disruptions in their relationships and functioning. Enabling behaviors that result from such efforts to keep the balance may seem counterproductive and ill-advised, but they're actually adaptive. So you can see the reciprocal function here that happens, that a family can get really stuck in. And this is about a family that's always trying to survive. The goal for families is often we have to survive. We got to figure out how to work our way through this. And so,
and to do so in a way where we're not publicly embarrassed, or, I mean, they're trying to keep a good face up, right?
Yes.
That's the whole idea, is that they don't want anybody to see how broken they are.
That's the secret keeping that comes with this disease.
Yep.
There's such deep shame that I don't want anybody to see it. So we'll cover all of these things up. So this daughter in this case is picking up the pieces to make sure nobody will notice, but also that the children are getting what they need.
And then so there's a whole bunch of people out there who grew up in this kind of a environment, and there's a whole program for them called Adult Children of Alcoholics. And so they grew up in this environment, and then they find out their life isn't working. They can't figure out why, and they find out, oh, I grew up in a family system that was kind of messed up. Right?
Yeah, that's spot on, Ed. I think the struggle is that if you grow up in a system like this, you're trained to operate relationally this way. And so this is often why we talk about the generational transmission, the patterns that we grow up and we can replicate in our own families in spite of a deep desire to not do it. we find ourselves all of a sudden, what happened here? I'm following some of the same things that I don't want from what I was experiencing growing up.
Well, there's a line in the Old Testament said the sins of the fathers are visited on the children to the sixth generation. I think that we're talking about this.
That's spot on. The notion of homeostasis is important. Systems seek homeostasis. If you address a symptom of dysfunction in a family, it will either return
you want to unpack, Michael? Just homeostasis is a 25-cent word. Help us out with that.
Yeah, homeostasis, equilibrium. I'm trying to create balance. I'm trying to make sure everything is okay. Another way is I'm trying to keep all the plates spinning in my family. And so if I try to address one symptom without understanding the problem, the problem will keep recurring because of that homeostasis. I'm trying to create some equilibrium that works for my family. I'm going to make it work. And as long as we don't talk about the alcoholism or the addiction, and someone may have a bad behavior, we try to fix that, but it keeps coming up, or it comes up at another parent, another part of the family, another child starts having a problem. That's because we may be missing the deeper issue.
Well, and maybe you're going to talk about this already, but there's a piece of denial in that too, right? Isn't there don't we have with this issue a real, for some reason, we all kind of want to look the other way, like the two brothers in the story from Noah, is that we don't want to see it.
Yeah, well, that's that deep shame, right? I don't want people to see this, because if they see it, they will know how broken I am. And that's the hardest piece. This slide, forgive me, the title, the header matches the background on this for the screen, but it's codependence is a complementary or parallel disease of alcoholism exhibited by the alcoholic's significant others. The codependent person presumably exhibits several symptoms associated with the disease. Examples like issues about control, perfectionism, frozen feelings, emotions, or blunting, and external referencing, and engaging in enabling behaviors. So again, we often see this, but I want to be careful here, because people can see this as a pathology. If we keep thinking of it that way, it may not help us. If we understand it, remember, it's a family system. The family system is trying to figure out how to operate and function, and they're very stuck. So next one is enabling, is described as behaviors that perpetuate another person's substance use. For example, protecting the person from experiencing the natural consequences of substance use that might have led to deterrence in the future, making access easier, covering up for the other person's drinking. If you remember the teenage daughter in the example, her behavior could be seen as enabling. She's not intervening on the alcohol use problem that her mother has. I would argue that she's a kid trying to figure out how to help my family function. And if we go to enabling or codependence, it can be perceived as I'm blaming her. But if we look at it from a family systems perspective, the family is stuck in a pattern that's not working. Or one other way of looking at it is it's functioning in an unhealthy way for them. And they are likely unable to see how to get out of it very easily.
It's funny. I just had an encounter, or someone shared with me what was happening in their parish, and they had a excuse me, I'm sorry. They had a music director who was not showing up, not following through, and this was going on for a long time. Well, it turned out that this individual had a gaming addiction and was being irresponsible with work. And the thing this person was saying was, we enabled that because we didn't say anything. We just let it go for so long that nobody wanted to say anything. I don't know if that falls into that category, but that was what their take on it was that something's wrong and you don't say anything. And I think, being Lutherans, we're chronically nice. And so we don't want to point out, when somebody's behavior is not appropriate and not okay, and we let it go. And we're not doing them any favors by not pointing it out.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the greater challenges is how can we be supportive to each other when somebody is suffering or struggling and we see it. It is a pretty uncomfortable thing to do, but really a courageous piece. And I suppose, well, we'll keep moving on to that. There's lots of thoughts about that. But this picture here is kind of a classic diagram that talks about addiction, where you have the dependent up top and the codependent. And often we can see patterns emerge in how families respond to someone who is in that dependent state, that addiction state. The family hero is someone often driven to perfectionism. If I can keep everything going and on top of things, I can help keep my family functioning. The scapegoat creates often an interesting function, because if I can take the spotlight off of the person that has this disease, I'm actually helping my family to not call out this thing that there's like a taboo or a shame that I'm trying to protect. The mascot can often be the comedian or the person that's driving attention away from something that's really uncomfortable. And then there can be the lost child that realizes that it's better just to not say anything. It's better to just be quiet and figure things out. And you can see how for each person in these roles can have a lifelong impact if they're learning a pattern to operate based on this sort of a pattern in their family system. One of the things that we see also in families where there's addiction is sort of the over-functioning, under-functioning. And so we take the load off another member of the subsystem in the family. Children who can become messengers between conflicted parents, parents who disengage from parenting because of an extremely involved other parent. There can be blame and criticisms that go with this. If you look at the example, you have a child, a teenager who is over-functioning. She's taking on a parent function to meet the needs of the family system. Whereas the mother in that case was under-functioning. The disease of alcoholism was affecting her ability to function, to do her job as a mom.
I've heard so many people who grew up in alcoholic families lament that they didn't have a childhood because their family situation forced them to be an adult way before they should have been. And I have Gail, Pastor Gail had asked the question that we can switch roles too. I mean, we can exchange roles over time, depending on what's available to us to cope.
Yeah, yes. And so often we see when if the addiction is still active and one member of the family leaves, it opens up the role for other family members to fill in that gap. Interestingly, though, when that member that left comes back into the family system, they're easily put back into the role again. I think we all can relate to when our families come together at family reunions, whether or not you have addiction or not, that we can come back and all of a sudden I feel like I'm playing like I'm number 2 out of 6 kids. I fall back into the same role that I had as a kid.
Now see, now that's an insight. Does that explain why, as much as I love my family, every time I spend time with them, I need therapy when I get home? Is that?
It can be, right? Because we grow up and we're ingrained in a way of operating, and sometimes we can't always catch it or see it. And so we come out from those experiences where, whoa, what just happened? I just fell back into some old ways and I need some help to kind of unwind from that. You bet.
Yeah.
Good point. So when you think about a system, these behaviors are more effectively understood in the context of the system, right? These behaviors, remember, it's a family system here. It can be an organization that has this, but we can look at them as an interactive pattern. Now, they're maladaptive, but are necessary for the survival of that family or group. That's the part that's important, right? these behaviors have a function. They're trying to survive as a family unit. And so people adapt to pick up these behaviors. It's usually insidious, which means it's the slow creeper. People don't start off their life saying, boy, I'm going to be an addict when I grow up. It's not how it works. It starts and is slow, often is insidious. And as someone lowers their level of functioning, if we talk about over-functioning, under-functioning, it is normal for a family to step in to fill in the gaps and voids. It's normal for families to do that. And so if we can understand that part of this role that addictions can play in families, it helps us to understand, Ed, to your point, if we can help a family understand this and figure it out, it can have so much greater effect on someone being successful in recovery, because it's a recovery not only of the person with this disease of addiction, it's a recovery for a family.
Yeah, so, I keep thinking about that image from the biblical image of Noah, and I just think about how that alcohol just really created a mess in that family.
Absolutely.
You know, it just made it just threw everything off.
Yeah. So when we talk about change typically means stress. And so, well, another way of thinking about it, for change to occur, I have to experience discomfort. I have to be uncomfortable to make an adaptation, either positive or negative. And it requires me to put energy into it, and often requires resources. And it's important because systems resist change, right? We're trying to keep that equilibrium, that balance. And if you're trying to tell me to change, and it's going to take a ton of work, and I'm the only one doing it, everybody else has to do some and they don't want to, I likely will say, I don't think I can do it. It won't work. So it's important to remember that change takes quite a bit of energy, and often it's resources to help people see a new way of operating. So when I sit down with families and they're in a stuck place, we first often have to sit down and talk about what are the rules we're just going to operate of in this room, because that's a new structure. Can we all agree to treat each other with dignity? Can we communicate and respect each other's perspectives? And then importantly, what is it we want to do different? How do we want to live and operate differently as a family? And how are we all going to contribute to making something different and change? That's where the hard work is.
A lot of change. I mean, this is a whole science of change, but a system like you were talking about, homeostasis, there's just a lot of force that wants it always to go back to the way it was. Churches can relate to this because they always want to go back to the way it was, but it changes as adapting to new circumstances.
You bet. This is signs of use within a family. Now, these are just some general ones. I'm sure we will talk more about these as we walk into this. So if you're talking with someone and you hear the person talk feel ashamed about a member's drinking, another family's member, they feel the shame, they won't want to talk about it. When we are ashamed, we withdraw. So when you see people withdrawing from involvement, it could be because of this shame factor. If you're in a family system and somebody is struggling, you start to question your own clarity and stability due to the problems with another member's drinking or drug use. It's extraordinarily stressful and pressure on people with this. And because of the taboo, it is often very difficult to talk about, or if they talk about it, it blows into large conflict and difficulty. So the family's thoughts and feelings revolve more and more around the user or problem related to use. So we're focusing on that. So this is often challenging because when a family does get to a place where they want to do an intervention, they're so frustrated and hurt about the person that's struggling with this disease. It's hard to look at their own part of the pattern that they're involved in and help. They often need help realizing that if they make changes, it can have an impact on the person struggling with the disease. I'll stay on this for a minute. When you have the disease of addiction, you're dependent on a substance, and you are dependent upon the social connections around you to keep in the pattern that you're in around the use. So if that holds true, the point of interventions is, out of care and love, can the family begin to create new boundaries, new ways of operating that can help someone be uncomfortable to make changes and seek help in treatment. This next point is important. Family members feel alone, frightened, anxious, angry, tense, frustrated much of the time. They feel helpless to fix the problem. This is an interesting experience because it is a similar feeling that someone with this disease usually experiences. If you could pull back the core of kind of the overt behaviors, someone with a disease of addiction feels these similarly. They feel helpless. I want this to be different, but I can't do it. Or I'm going to start and I'll try, but then it collapses, and there's this helpless feeling they have, and deep, deep shame.
Mm.
And so it's important to remember that, because one of the hardest things we can see in families or in the community is when somebody has this disease, it is sometimes difficult to maintain compassion for someone that's struggling with often behaviors that are very bad, antisocial behaviors, hurtful, harmful things. So these are just some of the things that families experience with this. So it's important that we have compassion not only for the family members, but a person that's struggling with this disease. So next one is just barriers. If there's a substance abuse disorder, there can be difficulties. These are often complex problems. Okay, so the bottom there, it says shame, but there can also be other parts of this. There can be a potential for violence or safety risks. There can be legal implications. Marriages can be so highly distressed that there's risk or thought of divorce. There can be criminal behavior that can be part of it. More than one family member may be actively abusing substances. I've had this happen a number of times where I was working with a young person who was coming in to get some support for some cannabis or marijuana use. And his parents were there, and I asked him, what are your thoughts about quitting? And his comment was, well, I'll quit if you quit, Dad. Right? And I hadn't even screened for that possibility. But it was really saying that this is a family issue. There's more than one person that was struggling with this. Often families that are struggling with this have high blame levels. So blame is an interesting dynamic in families. It's a protective function, right? I feel that you're blaming me, so I'm going to blame you. So blame is a way to deflect attention. It's a defensive measure. And so typically when we see blame, we know that we have to slow way down to help people create more security so they feel like they can talk more openly with each other. Sometimes that takes time. Practical barriers. We all have experienced that with COVID. This is getting better, but trying to get people together to try to talk about stuff has been very difficult. We do have technology which can help, but it's not quite the same as being face-to-face. So geography, schedules, childcare, reimbursement. If the primary person who has a substance use disorder is also the primary breadwinner, to try to have that person get help may impact the finances of a family, which creates a barrier for them. There can be other complex family problems. There can be other mental health pieces. I didn't put this in here, but there's a very high comorbidity. What does that mean? It means that if somebody has a substance use disorder, the numbers I'm seeing is between 65 and 85% of them also have a mental health disorder as well. So we'll see commonality of anxiety or depression or other mental health related matters. So if you're treating one, it's many treatment centers will just say we're going to assume that it's there unless we see evidence otherwise.
I'm becoming more and more convinced that a lot of addiction is self-treatment for a mental health issue or trauma of some kind.
Ed, that's a great point. There's a lot of research on the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that I don't have time to walk into, but if you're hungry for that, look it up, adverse childhood experiences. And there's huge correlations with having these adverse childhood experiences that lead to high risk, especially drinking is one of those results.
Yes, and other health issues, but the higher you score, the chances of you getting either health issues or addiction issues goes up. It's a very strong correlation. I would encourage people to go look that up. It's very easy. It takes just a second. Google ACEs, do the 10 questions. It was very eye-opening for me, because for me it was I did it, found out, it says if you have 4 or more positive answers, that you really need to pay attention to this. And I had 7. And I'm not proud of that, but it was really great information to have, because I thought, well, this explains a whole lot of stuff for me. It really is. And what was amazing while taking that was how many of them that I answered positive to that I thought, oh, that's considered not okay. When you grow up in a crazy family, you don't know what's okay and what's not okay. And so I had traumatic experiences that I didn't even know were traumatic. So you can carry that stuff around for a lot of years.
Yeah, just one more quick note on that. The ACEs were built in California, the insurance company Kaiser Permanente. I think they did an analysis of participants in that insurance. They were trying to research obesity, if there's any corollaries, but then they dug down and looked over 20,000 people's records and were able to identify these strong ACE factors. And the more you have, obviously, the more risk you have of having future difficulties.
Yeah, and Sherry Faber just put a link to it on the in the chat page if you want to look it up. And just another word on this, because I think this is really shedding some light on addiction. But Gabor Mate, Dr. Mate, does some work up in Vancouver and has written some amazing books. But he talks about childhood trauma as a leading indicator for likelihood of addiction, but he explains it through brain science and talks about dopamine receptors and serotonin levels. And when you're raised in a family where you're getting listened to and cared for and loved appropriately, you develop those receptors normally, but in traumatic situation, you don't. And that's why that's why somebody who doesn't have a drug issue or grew up in a good family doesn't need any more extra dopamine or serotonin, but those who lack it experience that in drugs, and they get that what's missing in their chemistry. And so they're sort of wired for it. It's just really fascinating to learn the science of it.
So some things to think about, skills for helping. I call this how to be the Good Samaritan. Now, if you remember the Good Samaritan, there was the injured person on the side of the road, and that Samaritan did not cure that person, but he did get him to the innkeeper to get help, right? Sometimes our job isn't to solve a problem, but to help somebody get to resources. That's on the list here. Please be aware that when we're talking with people that are struggling with this disease, a family member or the person with this disease, be aware that there is a deep hurt and shame that they experience. It's also important to be able to have boundary setting. This is interesting because if you're outside of a family system and you're coming in, they may or may not let you in, but you also have to be clear, here's what I can do and what I can't do. I can listen and I can hear, I can be present with you. I can't solve this for you, but I can help you call someone that could get you to the right support or help. And in families, often that's where the work is healing, that sometimes the boundaries within the family were problematic and needed to be reset. So if you go back to the example we used in the beginning, if that mom, that single mom, were able to get into recovery, one of the jobs of that family system would be to reorganize it. So mom could step back into the mom job, and the teenager could just focus on being a teenager and creating different boundaries so that that kiddo could just be worried about being a kid and not have to take on those parent functions. So that's how we want to reset boundaries within families. This happens with organizations as well if there's a dysfunction that's happening. I put active listening. I'm sure you guys have heard the old saying, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And so it is so important to be able to be present with someone, to listen to them and let them share what's happening. It's quite a gift when somebody chooses to do that. The next one is how to master the intervention. Do you want to be healed? Do you want support? And you have to let go of outcomes. It's not your job to solve somebody else's problem, but to invite them. Would you like some support in looking at some options? Could we go to
It's a powerful question. It's a powerful and a loving question to ask somebody. Is this okay with you? I mean, to be like this, is this where you want to be? It really forces them to think, and you have to be a little bit bold to ask it, but it can be a very loving question.
Yeah, in caring, it's.
And I got to say, Jesus said that to a lot of people. Do you want to be healed? I'm sorry, I had to throw that in.
I thank you, Ed. Understand your competency for helping, right? You don't have to be an expert to do this. We're all in the body of Christ, and so important to remember that our job is to be present and be helpful as best we can, to be able to help with resources. If I can't help you, can I help you find someone? Or I know someone that we could go talk to. Let's go together. Can we go to the doctors today? Empathy is important. Embracing others' pain. And if you do a lot of this work, you have to build a resilience to know that somebody else's pain is not mine. And it ties back into the boundary piece. And it's also important that we build chains of support. It's often families that are struggling, it's not going to be just one person or one resource to give them help. It may be multiple resources. They may need folks in their faith community to provide prayer for them. They may need a family therapist. They may need a treatment. There may be other therapeutic needs or family needs, survival needs that they have that we would want to consider, to remember that it's not just one thing, it's often multiple things that people are needing with this disease. Well, what does a family need when addiction is present? And how can faith communities integrate family needs with ministry? Here's just some things, and I know, Ed, you have a lot to share about this, but it's having an awareness of where do we send someone? How do we get somebody into treatment? What are the referral sources that we can have to help let people look at options for them? And a faith community can create stabilization, create a place of connection for them, to know that they're not alone, and that you're going to journey with them, that you may not be able to solve this current issue, but you can be with them. Trying to help create structure for families. What are the next steps? Sometimes baby steps are what we talk about. What feels okay to do today? How about we call your doctor and let's get you in to talk to your doctor? Or how about we call Pastor Ed and let's go see if we can just get a call with him and see if he has some ideas. Proactive approaches. This is probably one of the greatest ones that I so appreciate your faith community taking a time to talk about this, because this sort of education is a proactive approach. We're taking time to help learn about this And so then we can lead to the next piece is how do we do preventive planning? How do we take a step ahead to educate each other, be there for each other, and know that this addiction is happening all over the place. We can work on systemic changes. How can we break the code of silence, the shame, the taboo around this to be more comfortable knowing that, hey, we can talk about this. We can bring this up. And we can talk about repair and healing and forgiveness, which I think is a key piece for families that are in the midst of this as they try to recover. There's typically lots of hurt and needing lots of support. Sometimes I get people, Ed, to your point, someone had called you and say, I've got someone I care about that's troubled. What should I do? I will often refer them to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 18. We need to go to the person first. Have you been able to try and talk to this person? If not, can you bring somebody else that cares? Can we together to see if that person can hear that? And then we go to the community. That's more the intervention piece, people coming together out of love and care with that. I'm going to say one more thing about that. I think interventions have had a hard history. There's this old notion that I've got to break somebody down to build them back up. I just want to clarify that is not true. It's not something that we come together and be abusive to someone if they're struggling. It has to come from compassion and care. And that is going to be the truest way to help somebody that's in a stuck place.
Right, Micheal, I know that most people have in mind that when you say intervention, it means a group of your family and friends surprises you with this gang up meeting. And I know that that's not really the model anymore. I mean, it was the model at one time, but they're finding that's not always helpful. But there's an organization in Nebraska that talks about interventions in a different way, but I think they call the program Flashing Your Brights. And basically he uses the example of when you're driving down the highway and you see somebody driving with their lights off, you flash your brights at them and you keep going. You don't turn around, chase them down and, try to, get them to get their lights on. And he uses as an example for how to do interventions. And intervention, they're finding what happens for people that finally get help. Usually it's a cumulative effect of a number of people flashing their brights. Important people like a teacher or a parent or a friend or a loved one or a cop or a court, a judge saying you need help, you got a problem. And of course, people's first reaction is, no, I don't. But if they start to hear that over and over, the problem is that we don't tend to flash our brights. When they see this particular issue, we don't do anything. And so I want to teach faith communities, flash your brights. You see somebody, you're singing in choir next to somebody and you smell it on their breath and you want to say, you doing okay? Are you drinking too much? That's an intervention right there. Yes. I mean, you brought it up and it's uncomfortable, but it's loving. And they're going to say, no, I'm fine. And then that's going to get through because most people who have an addiction problem they really honestly think nobody can see it. They do. They really think it's invisible. And when you point it out, it's shocking because you're like, oh my gosh, you can see that? It gets through and it really bugs them and they lose sleep over it and then they have to deny it more. And then somebody else says it. It starts to work on them. But I think that's an intervention strategy that faith communities could employ that would be loving and effective. And the other thing about faith communities is the problem is they're not doing anything. Most of them, almost none of them. And I'm trying to make the case that, if you just had a bulletin in your narthex, that your church that, I don't know what you put in the bulletin, but if it's about substance abuse or addiction or something, so people almost always turn to a church for help. When they're in their disease, they'll go to church because they'll wake up with a hangover. They'll have an conversation with God and say, okay, God, if I straighten up my life, will you help, fix things for me? Because they know something's wrong. They don't know what it is. But many times they think, well, God's going to help them. So they think, I'll go back to church. And they go to church and they walk away going, there's nothing there to help me. But if they see a brochure, they'll pick it up. And it's an intervention. And it's better than nothing. But I can tell you anecdotally, I know there's my own experience is that I'd given up on the church, and I came into the Lutheran church because I happened to wander into a Lutheran camp in the wilderness that was doing a 12-step workshop. And I thought, here's a church that's talking about this. I want to be a Lutheran there. Okay. So, and then I went to seminary and found out hardly any Lutheran churches are talking about this. So I was like, oh, well, I feel like God kind of did a bait and switch on me there. But yeah, churches aren't talking about this. And if they did, they could have an impact. Even a little thing like having a brochure or something in your bulletin could make a huge difference. A message to people that, we do care. We know people struggle and they hurt and they need help, and we care about them. And yeah, I also want to talk, just want to throw this in too. My mom, there was 8 kids in my family. We were really messed up. As I told you, I had 7 ACEs out of 10. And almost all my siblings have an addiction problem. Almost all of them have been through treatment and recovery. And my oldest brother went to treatment first, and then he told my mom about this whole thing about addiction. And she went and got educated. She joined Al-Anon, and she learned about the disease. So she began to intervene on all of us. And the way she would do that is she would say, "How's your drinking?" I'd come visit mom, and she'd say, "How's it going?" And I'd go, "Oh, this isn't working out. That's not." If you're in your addiction, things aren't working well in life. Almost always. Your life is just pretty miserable. And she would go, "Do you think it's your drinking or your drugs?" And I would get so mad. It's like Noah in that depiction that the person who gets called out gets angry because and that's why we typically don't want to say something to people, because they're going to react strongly. And nobody likes strong emotional reactions. But so I would go, "Mom, you always think it's that." And I would get so mad. And, but she would never let up. Every time she saw me, "How's your drinking?" And finally, when I was ready to get help, I called mom, and she got me help. And she said, "We'll come and get you." And then she went to an Al-Anon meeting, and they said, no, don't go get him. Find him a treatment center and tell him to go there. And so that's what they did. And so I was like, "You're not going to come and get me? You're not going to rescue me?" And she said, "No, you need treatment. You go to a treatment center." My mom said it was the hardest thing she ever did in her life was to say no. She wasn't going to enable me anymore. And so she said no. And if she hadn't said no and broken my heart and hers, I'm sure, to tell your own child when they're at their ropes in, "No, I'm not going to help you." But it was the best thing she ever did for me, was to say, "No, I want to help you, but here's how I'm going to help you." And powerful, saved my life.
And I appreciate that. Your mom, what a courageous person, right? She chose to learn about something that was happening in her family, and so she was part of the dynamic right before, and she realized and then made steps to change, which sounds like it had a ripple effect on everybody.
Everybody's in recovery now, my family.
So it's a great example, because in families where this is occurring, it can be one person just takes steps to learn and make some changes that can ripple effect through. It may take time. Yeah. Remember, the dependence is not just on the substance, it's on the patterns of how people live, and that comfort of the disease. That's really not comfortable, but it's a pattern that people get stuck in.
Well, the other thing I believe about this is that I couldn't save myself. I didn't know what my problem was. I was in denial about it. I knew something was seriously wrong, and I couldn't do anything about it. I was stuck. And I'm convinced that those with addiction can't save themselves. They need somebody who loves them to intervene. And that's why it's so important faith communities learn about this, because if we're going to save lives, we need to know how to do it, how to recognize a life that needs saving, and how to lovingly save people from killing themselves.
Well, you guys, we've got a few minutes here. If there are, I just invite people to have questions. So want to just open the doorway here. If there are people that have comments or questions, we'd be happy to share them.
I've got one here. I don't know if it's a comment. It looks more of a comment than a question. Pastor Gail says, "I know for myself, putting boundaries on the addict was the toughest thing to do, but I also had to let the addict fail."
it's hard sometimes because that's sometimes we have to. You guys have heard the old analogy, you got to put the air mask on yourself first before you can help somebody else. Sometimes that's what's happening in families. I've got to put a boundary up so that I can stay in a healthy place. And that sometimes results in somebody that's struggling to see them relapse or come back into it. Would argue that if that person is able to stay in a healthy, stronger place, it does create a ripple effect on the system that can open the door up to sobriety or change further down the road.